I lost everything because of your father, Maria whispered, her calloused hand trembling as it hovered just inches from Richard Coleman's fountain pen. The boardroom froze in shocked silence. 22 executives in tailored suits stopped breathing simultaneously as the cleaning woman, a figure they'd passed in hallways for years without a second glance, stood defiantly beside the most powerful man in the room. Security personnel moved toward her, but Coleman raised his hand, stopping them with a gesture. His ice-blue eyes, known for their merciless assessment of business opportunities, locked onto the face of the woman who had dared to interrupt the most significant acquisition meeting of the year. "Let her speak," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command that had built a $3.7 billion empire. The cleaning cart still waited outside the boardroom door, abandoned when Maria had made the split-second decision that would forever alter both their lives. The document beneath Coleman's hand represented the culmination of 6 months of aggressive negotiations, a $214 million real estate deal that would transform the aging West Side neighborhood into luxury condominiums, one signature away from completion, one signature away from displacing 178 families. "Sir, we should continue," Thomas Blackwell, the chief legal counsel, interjected with barely contained fury. "We have the mayor waiting for confirmation, and the press release is scheduled for." "I said, let her speak," Coleman repeated, never taking his eyes off Maria. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Maria Vasquez had immigrated from Guatemala 27 years ago with nothing but $87 in her pocket and dreams as vast as the country she'd entered. Now, at 53, her body bore the evidence of decades of physical labor. Bent fingers from years of scrubbing, a slight hunch from mopping endless floors, eyes perpetually reddened from industrial cleaning chemicals. Yet in this moment, she stood straighter than any executive in the room. "Your father destroyed my family's bakery in 1988, she continued, her accent thickening with emotion. "Not with malice, but with a signature just like the one you're about to make. He didn't know us. He never saw the faces of the people affected by his business decisions." A collective gasp rippled through the boardroom. Richard Coleman's relationship with his late father, real estate pioneer Harold Coleman, was legendary for its complexity. Respect mingled with competitive rivalry. No one dared mention the elder Coleman in business meetings. "Our bakery was small, but it supported 3 generations of my family. We had been there for 32 years when your father's company bought the building and tripled the rent overnight for market adjustment. We couldn't pay. We lost everything, not just our business but our home that was above it. My grandfather, who had started the bakery, died 3 months later. The doctors called it heart failure, but we knew it was heartbreak." Coleman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Behind his carefully controlled expression, calculations were visibly running, not financial ones but something more complex, more human. "And now," Maria continued, finding strength in finally speaking a truth she'd carried silently for decades, "you're about to do the same thing to the West Side. I clean the homes of 5 families who live there. The Morales family, their daughter just got accepted to medical school, the first in their family to go to college. The Wilsons, he's a firefighter who saved 3 children last year during the downtown fire. The Patels run the pharmacy that gives medicine on credit to elderly people who can't afford their prescriptions until Social Security checks arrive." She pointed to the contract with a finger twisted from arthritis. "This paper doesn't show you their faces. It doesn't tell you their stories. It just shows numbers." The silence in the room had transformed from shocked to profound. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their Italian leather chairs. "Mrs. Vasquez," Coleman finally spoke, surprising everyone by knowing her name. "How long have you worked in this building?" 7 years, 4 months, and 12 days, Mr. Coleman. "And in that time, have you ever seen me make a mistake?" The question hung in the air, seemingly a prelude to her dismissal. Security inched forward again. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Every night when I empty your trash can. You throw away the children's drawings your secretary puts on your desk, the ones from the children's hospital your company sponsors. You don't even look at them first." Something flickered across Coleman's face, an emotion no one in the room could identify because they'd never seen it there before. Vulnerability, perhaps, or recognition. He looked down at the contract, 57 pages of legal language that would transform a neighborhood into a goldmine. His pen remained untouched. 24 years ago, he said quietly, my father came home after closing a major deal. I was 16. He poured himself a scotch and told me the secret to success was never to think about the people on the other side of the contract. They're not people, Richie, he said. They're obstacles to progress. Coleman's gaze returned to Maria's face. I've lived by that philosophy my entire career. The room remained suspended in tense silence. No one could predict what would happen next. Then, Richard Coleman did something none of the 22 executives had ever witnessed in their years working for him. He pushed the contract away. Mrs. Vasquez, would you be willing to introduce me to these families you mentioned? The Morales, the Wilsons, and the Patels. Blackwell sputtered in protest. Richard, the closing deadline will be extended, Coleman finished firmly. Or the deal will change. Perhaps both. He stood, buttoning his bespoke suit jacket with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to power. This meeting is adjourned until further notice. As the stunned executives filed out, Coleman addressed Maria once more. My father taught me to see obstacles instead of people. Perhaps it's time I learned to see differently. That evening, Richard Coleman walked through the West Side neighborhood, guided by Maria Vasquez. He sat in humble living rooms, drinking too-sweet coffee and listening to stories of lives that had been invisible to him despite existing just 3 miles from his penthouse. He saw family photos on worn walls, smelled home-cooked meals that carried the heritage of different cultures, and witnessed the dignity of people who had built lives with far fewer resources than he had ever known. 3 days later, when the boardroom reconvened, Coleman presented a transformed proposal. The West Side would still be developed, but with current residents given ownership stakes and affordable housing guarantees. Commercial spaces would prioritize existing local businesses with subsidized rents. A community development fund would ensure that gentrification wouldn't displace the neighborhood's heart while improving its infrastructure. The profit margin would be smaller, but as Coleman explained to his bewildered executives, we're not just in the business of building properties. We're in the business of building communities. 6 months later, when ground broke on the West Side Renaissance Project, Maria Vasquez stood beside Richard Coleman at the ceremony, not as a cleaning woman, but as the newly appointed Director of Community Relations for Coleman Enterprises, bringing perspectives that had never before entered the company's executive conversations. The secret connection between them, the painful history of a bakery lost and a lesson taught by a father who saw people as obstacles, had transformed not just 2 lives but an entire approach to business and community development. Sometimes the most profound business education comes not from Wharton or Harvard, but from those who clean the offices after everyone else has gone home. The details of the contract that Maria had stopped Richard Coleman from signing became public knowledge 3 weeks after the dramatic boardroom confrontation. What emerged shocked even the most cynical observers of corporate America's ruthless real estate practices. It was engineered to create maximum displacement with minimal legal exposure, explained Jerome Washington, a housing rights attorney who reviewed the document after Coleman himself authorized its release. I've been fighting predatory development for 20 years, and I've never seen anything this sophisticated in its cruelty. The 57-page agreement, drafted by Blackwell's legal team, contained provisions that would have systematically dismantled the West Side community through a series of seemingly unrelated actions. Rent increases were deliberately staggered to prevent unified tenant resistance. Essential maintenance would be strategically delayed to create uninhabitable conditions that circumvented eviction protections. Commercial leases contained hidden clauses allowing for immediate termination once residential vacancy reached certain thresholds. Most disturbing was Appendix C, labeled innocuously as Community Transition Planning, which outlined a strategy for targeting the most vulnerable residents first: elderly tenants on fixed incomes, single-parent households, and immigrant families with limited English proficiency. They mapped out exactly who would break first under financial pressure, Washington noted during a community forum held at West Side's St. Mark's Church. It wasn't just about acquiring property, It was about breaking a community's will to fight back. The revelation turned what might have been a local story into national news. Coleman's decision to release the unredacted contract, against the vehement objections of his legal department, became as controversial as the document itself. "I want other developers to see what I almost did," Coleman explained in his first public statement about the incident. "This contract represents everything wrong with how we approach urban development. I'm not proud that my company created it, but I believe exposing it is the first step toward genuine accountability." The fallout was immediate. Thomas Blackwell resigned the day after the contract's release, along with 3 other executives who had been instrumental in its creation. Investigations into their previous development projects revealed similar tactics had been employed successfully in other cities, displacing thousands of families over the previous decade. For the residents of Westside, the contract's exposure validated what they had long suspected but couldn't prove, that the system was deliberately rigged against them. Lucia Morales, whose daughter had been accepted to medical school, organized a neighborhood archiving project to document the community's reaction. "Before, when we complained about what was happening to our neighborhoods, people called us paranoid or said we were playing the victim," Lucia explained as she collected interviews from longtime residents. "Now we have proof that it wasn't accidental. The harm was intentional, calculated, and written into binding legal documents." The contract itself became a teaching tool in law schools and urban planning programs across the country. Professor Diane Nguyen of Columbia University incorporated it into her course on ethical development. "I tell my students, this is what happens when we separate the business of building from the humanity of housing." This document quantified human suffering and disguised it as progress. Meanwhile, Maria Vasquez found herself in an unexpected position as the contract's provisions became public. Having spent years invisible to the power brokers whose offices she cleaned, she was now sought after for interviews and speaking engagements. Community organizations asked her to share the story of her confrontation with Coleman. "I am not special," she insisted during a community meeting at Westside's public library. "I just reached a point where fear of losing my job became less important than preventing others from losing their homes. Many people feel this way. I was just in the right place at the exact right moment." Richard Coleman's transformation continued to unfold in ways that surprised even his closest associates. He established a legal defense fund for communities facing similar predatory practices, personally contributing $5 million to its launch. More significantly, he began working with state legislators to draft what would become known as the Transparency in Development Act, requiring all major urban development contracts to include clear language about community impact and displacement mitigation. The most dangerous aspect of these contracts is the deliberately obscure language, Coleman testified before a state Senate committee. "As someone who has both created and signed such documents, I can tell you they are designed to hide their true impact from the public, and sometimes even from the people signing them." Not everyone celebrated these developments. Industry colleagues openly criticized Coleman for what they called his betrayal of business interests. Real estate publications questioned his stability and judgment. Several investors threatened to withdraw from Coleman Enterprises entirely. "Richard has lost his edge," complained developer Marcus Reynolds at an industry conference. "The moment you start prioritizing community over profit, you've forgotten what business is about." Coleman's response became the most quoted business statement of the year. "If your business model requires destroying lives to succeed, perhaps it's your business model, not the lives, that needs to be reconsidered." 6 months after the confrontation, as construction began on the reimagined Westside Renaissance project, Maria and Richard found themselves standing together at the groundbreaking ceremony. The project now included dedicated affordable housing, spaces for local businesses at subsidized rates, a community center, and, most meaningfully, a small business incubator specifically designed to help neighborhood entrepreneurs build generational wealth. "I keep thinking about my grandfather's bakery," Maria told Richard as they watched community members take ceremonial shovels for the first dig. "How different our lives might have been if someone had stopped your father from signing his contract." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I can't undo what my father did, but perhaps we can create a new model for what's possible when business and community work together rather than against each other." As the ceremony concluded, Maria noticed a small group of corporate executives observing from the periphery, representatives from 3 major development companies who had requested meetings with Coleman to learn more about his new approach. "Do you think they're serious about changing?" she asked him. Coleman watched his industry colleagues with a measured expression. "Some are here out of genuine interest. Others are just watching to see if I fail. Either way, they're paying attention, and that's the first step toward change." What neither of them could have anticipated was how the exposed contract would catalyze a nationwide movement for development transparency, or how their unlikely partnership would reshape urban renewal policies across the country. The predatory contract that would have destroyed Westside instead became the document that saved dozens of similar communities as its provisions were studied, understood, and systematically dismantled in city after city. The contract that nearly ruined lives had, through its exposure and rejection, begun to save them instead. 6 weeks after the groundbreaking ceremony, Richard Coleman called for an unprecedented press conference at Coleman Tower's Grand Atrium. Financial analysts, business reporters, and real estate insiders packed the space, speculating wildly about the announcement. Rumors had circulated for days, everything from Coleman's retirement to a complete corporate restructuring. No one predicted what actually happened. Richard Coleman walked onto the stage accompanied not by his executive team, but by Maria Vasquez and 7 Westside residents representing different aspects of the community. A teacher, a nurse, a small business owner, an elder care worker, a community organizer, a public defender, and a high school student. They sat in a semicircle of chairs behind him as he approached the podium alone. "For 30 years, Coleman began, his voice echoing through the hushed atrium, "I have built my reputation and my fortune on a business philosophy I inherited from my father. That successful development requires disconnection from the human impact of our decisions. Today, I am publicly rejecting that philosophy." The crowd stirred. Camera shutters clicked rapidly. Coleman Enterprises is announcing 3 initiatives that will fundamentally transform how we operate. He paused, looking back at Maria and the Westside residents before continuing. "First, effective immediately, I am transferring 30% of Coleman Enterprises ownership to a newly established community impact trust." Gasps rippled through the audience. On Wall Street, trading of Coleman Enterprises stock was temporarily halted as prices fluctuated wildly in response to the news breaking across financial tickers. This trust will be governed by a board comprising both development experts and representatives from communities where we build. Their approval will be required for all future projects, with profit sharing directed back into affordable housing initiatives. The business reporters furiously typed on their devices. This wasn't just a corporate restructuring. It was a complete reimagining of how development companies could operate. Second, I am establishing the Coleman Transparency Institute with a $75 million endowment to expose predatory development practices nationwide. The institute will provide legal support to communities facing displacement, conduct research on equitable development models, and create certification standards for ethical urban renewal. In the audience, developers from competing firms shifted uncomfortably. Several stood and left the room. Finally, Coleman continued, seemingly unfazed by their departure. "I am personally divesting $300 million of my fortune, approximately 1/3 of my net worth, to establish community land trusts in neighborhoods at risk of gentrification across 5 major cities." The announcement sent shock waves through the room. This wasn't corporate philanthropy as usual. It was a fundamental redistribution of power and capital that challenged the very foundations of real estate development. Coleman stepped away from the podium and invited Maria Vasquez to speak. The cleaning woman who had confronted a millionaire now addressed the national media with quiet dignity. "Real change doesn't come from charity," she said, her voice steady despite her lack of experience with public speaking. "It comes from shifting who makes decisions. For too long, people like me have been decided about, not decided with." Mr. Coleman's actions today aren't just about money. They're about recognizing that communities should control their own futures. The press conference extended for nearly 2 hours as Coleman and the West Side representatives fielded questions about implementation details. Throughout the session, Coleman repeatedly deferred to the community members' expertise about neighborhood needs, demonstrating in real time the power-sharing approach he was advocating. The business world's reaction was swift and polarized. Coleman Enterprises stock initially plummeted 17% before stabilizing at an 8% loss by day's end. Major shareholders demanded emergency board meetings. The Wall Street Journal published an editorial condemning Coleman's actions as a dangerous precedent that threatens the fundamental principles of shareholder primacy. But there was another reaction that caught many by surprise. By evening, 3 major pension funds and 2 university endowments had issued statements supporting Coleman's decision and increasing their investment positions. The California Public Employees Retirement System, which managed over $400 billion in assets, announced it would develop new investment guidelines favoring companies with community governance structures similar to Coleman's model. "We believe this represents the future of sustainable urban development," their statement read. Mr. Coleman's approach aligns long-term business viability with community stability, a model that reduces investment risk while increasing social impact. The most dramatic moment came 3 days later when Coleman appeared before his company's furious board of directors, many of whom had been blindsided by his announcement. The meeting, later described by one attendee as corporate governance bloodsport, lasted 14 hours as Coleman defended his decision against accusations of breach of fiduciary duty. "You've destroyed shareholder value on a whim," accused board member Gregory Harmon, a major investor. "This company isn't your personal charity." On the contrary, Coleman replied calmly, "I'm securing this company's long-term future. The development model we've been using is unsustainable. It creates community resistance, regulatory backlash, and reputational damage that ultimately undermines our business." He presented market analysis showing how projects with community support encountered fewer delays, reduced legal challenges, and lower security costs. What looks like idealism is actually practical business strategy. We're not just doing good, we're reducing risk and creating new market opportunities. By meeting's end, Coleman had survived a vote to remove him as CEO by the narrowest of margins. A single vote. The board reluctantly agreed to a 6-month trial period for his new approach, with quarterly performance reviews. That evening, exhausted but resolute, Coleman met Maria for coffee at a small West Side bakery owned by the Diaz family, who had operated in the neighborhood for 3 generations. "The board nearly fired me today," he admitted, stirring his coffee absently. Maria studied him thoughtfully. "Do you regret your decision?" Coleman looked around the bakery, watching as Mr. Diaz chatted with customers he knew by name while his teenage son learned to operate the register. The space hummed with community connection. "My father would have considered this bakery inefficient," he said. "Too small, too personal, not maximizing revenue per square foot." He never understood that some businesses create value that doesn't appear on balance sheets. He turned back to Maria. "No, I don't regret it. For the first time in my career, I'm building something that matters beyond the next quarterly report." What neither of them could anticipate was how Coleman's shocking decision would spark a national conversation about corporate governance and community control that extended far beyond real estate development. Within months, executives in industries from healthcare to manufacturing were facing questions about community impact and decision-making structures that had previously been considered outside the realm of business concern. The millionaire who had built his fortune on disconnection had connected his company's fate to the communities it served, and in doing so, had issued a challenge to American capitalism itself. 1 year after Richard Coleman's press conference shocked the business world, Maria Vasquez stood at the podium of the National Urban Development Conference, not as a cleaning woman, but as the newly appointed executive director of the Coleman Transparency Institute. Before her sat an audience of developers, urban planners, community organizers, and policymakers who had gathered to hear about what industry publications had begun calling the Coleman model. "I never planned to be here," Maria began, her voice steady despite her still-present discomfort with public speaking. "A year ago, I was invisible to most of the people in this room. I cleaned your offices after you went home. I emptied your trash cans. I wiped coffee rings from your conference tables." She paused, surveying the crowd. "Today, I help determine how billions of development dollars are spent across this country. This is not just my personal transformation. It represents the transformation that happens when we recognize that expertise comes in many forms, including the lived experience of communities. The journey to this moment had been neither simple nor smooth for either Maria or Richard. The 6-month trial period imposed by Coleman Enterprises board had been a crucible of constant pressure and scrutiny. Financial analysts had predicted disaster. Industry colleagues had openly wagered on Coleman's failure. Several major clients had immediately withdrawn their business, unwilling to participate in what the Wall Street Journal had dubbed Coleman's community experiment. Yet against all expectations, Coleman Enterprises hadn't collapsed. Instead, after an initial period of adjustment, the company had begun to demonstrate surprising resilience. The Community Impact Trust's involvement had indeed slowed some decision-making processes, as critics had predicted. However, it had also eliminated costly project delays caused by community opposition and reduced legal expenses by nearly 60%. Projects moved more slowly at the outset but encountered fewer obstacles during implementation. By the end of the 6-month trial, Coleman Enterprises was reporting a modest 4% increase in completed project efficiency despite the governance changes. More significantly, the company had begun attracting an entirely new category of clients: municipalities and institutional investors specifically seeking development partners with community accountability mechanisms. 3 major university endowments had shifted their real estate investment portfolios to Coleman Enterprises, citing risk reduction through community engagement. "We're seeing a recalibration of how risk is evaluated," Coleman explained in a Harvard Business Review interview. "Traditional development models treat community resistance as an inevitable externality. Our approach incorporates community voices early, which actually creates more predictable outcomes." For Maria, the transformation had been even more profound. Her appointment to lead the Transparency Institute had required her to develop entirely new skills virtually overnight. She had enrolled in weekend business courses at the local community college, worked with a speaking coach to overcome her fear of public presentation, and built a team that combined academic researchers with community organizers. The hardest part wasn't learning new skills. She confided to her daughter during a rare evening when she wasn't working late. "It was believing I deserved to be in these rooms making these decisions. For decades, I was told explicitly and implicitly that cleaning was all I was qualified to do." Under her leadership, the Institute had already assisted 14 communities facing predatory development, providing legal support that had prevented over 3,000 displacement evictions. More importantly, it had begun publishing transparency guidelines that were being adopted by municipal planning departments across the country. Not everyone celebrated these changes. Richard Coleman still received death threats from anonymous sources. Investment banks continued to downgrade Coleman Enterprises stock, despite its stable performance. Conservative business publications ran opinion pieces warning about the dangerous precedent of community control over development decisions. Most painfully, Richard's relationship with his brother Michael, who had served as the company's CFO for 15 years, had fractured beyond repair. Michael had resigned the day after the press conference, publicly declaring that Richard had betrayed our father's legacy. They hadn't spoken since. 6 months into her role at the Institute, Maria faced her own crisis when investigative journalists uncovered her undocumented immigration status. Information leaked by those seeking to undermine the Institute's work. Rather than hiding or resigning, Maria had made the courageous decision to publicly acknowledge her status and use her platform to highlight the contributions of undocumented workers to America's economy. "For 27 years, I have cleaned offices, paid taxes, raised children who are now citizens, and contributed to this country," she stated in a press conference that drew national attention. "My documentation status doesn't change the value of my work or my insights." The revelation had triggered both backlash and unexpected support. Immigration authorities had initially moved to begin deportation proceedings, only to face immediate legal challenges from a coalition of civil rights organizations. Meanwhile, a bipartisan group of state legislators had introduced special legislation providing a path to legal status for Maria and others in similar circumstances who had demonstrated extraordinary civic contribution. Through these challenges, Richard and Maria had developed a working relationship unlike any other in corporate America. Not quite friendship, not quite professional collaboration, but a unique partnership forged through shared purpose and mutual respect. "We come from completely different worlds," Richard acknowledged during a joint interview with the New York Times. But we're both trying to reimagine what development can be when it serves more than profit. As Maria concluded her keynote address at the Urban Development Conference, she introduced the Institute's most ambitious initiative yet, a nationwide certification program for ethical development, with rigorous standards for community input, displacement prevention, and affordable housing inclusion. For too long, we've accepted the false choice between economic growth and community stability, she told the audience. The next phase of our work is proving these goals can reinforce rather than oppose each other. After thunderous applause, Maria left the stage and found Richard waiting in the wings. "They're actually listening," she said, still sounding slightly amazed by her own influence. Richard nodded. "Because you're saying things that needed to be said decades ago. How does it feel to be on that stage instead of cleaning it?" Maria considered the question seriously. Different. Important. Terrifying. She smiled slightly. But no more terrifying than walking into that boardroom a year ago. Later that evening, they sat together in a quiet corner of the conference hotel's restaurant, reviewing plans for the coming year. On the table between them lay architectural drawings for what would become the Institute's most ambitious project: the transformation of an abandoned factory complex into a mixed-use development combining affordable housing, cooperative business spaces, and a training center for ethical development practices. "We're calling it Phoenix Commons," Maria explained, tracing the outlines with fingers still slightly bent from years of physical labor, "because it's rising from the ashes of a failed industrial model, just like our work is rising from the failures of traditional development." Richard studied the plans thoughtfully. "My father would have hated everything about this project," he said finally, "which probably means we're doing something right." As they continued their discussion, neither fully realized the extent to which their individual transformations had already begun changing the landscape of American urban development, or how their unlikely partnership had become a powerful symbol of what was possible when decision-making power was genuinely shared between capital and community. The cleaning woman and the millionaire had both been transformed, not just in their professional roles but in their fundamental understanding of value, power, and possibility. 3 years after Maria Vasquez whispered those fateful words to Richard Coleman, the impact of their partnership had expanded far beyond Coleman Enterprises, or even the real estate development industry. What began as a single confrontation in a boardroom had evolved into what the Harvard Business Review now called the Vasquez-Coleman effect, a fundamental rethinking of corporate governance, community engagement, and the relationship between capital and labor. The transformation manifested in ways both dramatic and subtle across America's business landscape. In corporate boardrooms, a new question had entered governance discussions. Who's our Maria? Companies began recognizing the critical insights that frontline workers could provide, not as token gestures toward inclusion, but as essential business intelligence that could prevent costly mistakes. Westbrook Financial, one of the nation's largest investment banks, had created a stakeholder advisory council that included representatives from janitorial staff, administrative support, and maintenance teams. Their chief investment officer credited the council with identifying critical flaws in a $2.4 billion acquisition that analysts had missed. "They saw problems we couldn't see from the executive floor," he admitted at an industry conference. "It's not charity or political correctness. It's accessing wisdom that was always there, but that we systematically ignored." Johnson Healthcare, a hospital management corporation operating in 38 states, had transformed its decision-making structure to include nursing assistants, custodial staff, and cafeteria workers in policy development, resulting in a 23% reduction in patient complaints and a significant decrease in staff turnover. "The Coleman model showed us that hierarchy often blocks information flow," explained their CEO, Dr. Sarah Williams. "When we flattened access to decision-making, we discovered our lowest-paid employees often had the clearest understanding of systemic problems. More profoundly, a new generation of business school graduates was entering the workforce with different expectations about corporate purpose and governance. The Coleman case study had become required reading at 78% of top-tier MBA programs. At Stanford Business School, applications for their social impact track had increased 340% in 3 years, with students specifically citing the Vasquez-Coleman partnership as their inspiration. 5 years ago, Our students wanted to be the next Elon Musk, observed Professor James Chun of the Wharton School. Now they want to be the next Richard Coleman, not because of his wealth, but because of how he redefined success. For Maria, watching this ripple effect unfold brought both satisfaction and occasional discomfort with her symbolic status. She had never sought to become an icon, yet found herself featured in management textbooks, cited in academic research, and referenced in policy debates about economic democracy. Sometimes I feel like Maria Vasquez has become something separate from me. She confided to her daughter during a rare weekend when she wasn't traveling for speaking engagements. People want to hear my story, but they often miss that it wasn't just about one brave moment. It was about decades of invisible work that preceded it. To address this disconnect, Maria had established the Invisible Labor Project within the Transparency Institute, an initiative documenting the contributions of service workers, care providers, and others whose essential work remained undervalued and underpaid. The project's first publication, The Economy of Maintenance, had become unexpected required reading in sociology departments nationwide. Richard Coleman's transformation had continued evolving in equally profound ways. Having survived the initial board challenge to his leadership, he had gradually rebuilt Coleman Enterprises into something entirely new, what business publications now classified as a community development corporation, though that term inadequately captured its innovative structure. The 30% ownership stake transferred to the Community Impact Trust had expanded to 51%, making community governance the controlling interest in the company's decisions. Far from destroying shareholder value as critics had predicted, this restructuring had attracted a different class of investors seeking both financial and social returns. Coleman Enterprises stock had recovered its initial losses and then gradually increased in value, outperforming the real estate sector average by 4.2% annually. More significantly, Richard had begun mentoring other CEOs interested in transitioning toward community-controlled models. What started as informal conversations had evolved into the Corporate Democracy Institute, a think tank dedicated to developing practical pathways for businesses to implement shared governance without sacrificing operational effectiveness. The biggest misconception is that this approach is purely idealistic, Richard explained during a TED Talk that would eventually receive over 7 million views. It's actually intensely practical. When decisions include those most affected by them, you get better information, stronger buy-in, and more sustainable outcomes. This isn't about charity, it's about creating more resilient businesses. The Phoenix Commons project that Maria and Richard had planned 3 years earlier now stood as a physical embodiment of their vision. A vibrant mixed-use development where 60% of housing units were permanently affordable, local businesses operated in cooperatively owned spaces, and the Ethical Development Training Center prepared a new generation of community-centered developers. On the 5th anniversary of their fateful boardroom encounter, Maria and Richard met at Phoenix Commons Rooftop Garden, a space cultivated by neighborhood residents that supplied produce to the building's cooperatively owned restaurant. The garden offered a panoramic view of the West Side neighborhood, where property values had increased moderately while displacement had been prevented through innovative ownership structures. "Did you ever imagine this?" Maria asked, gesturing toward the thriving community below. "When you tore up that contract 5 years ago?" Richard shook his head. "I was just trying to avoid making a terrible mistake. I had no vision beyond that moment. And now," he considered the question carefully, "now I understand what my father never did. That business divorced from humanity isn't just morally wrong. It's strategically flawed. Real value isn't created by extraction. It's created by connection." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a delegation of international visitors, government officials and business leaders from Brazil, Ghana, South Korea, and India who had come to study the Coleman model for potential implementation in their own countries. The Vasquez-Coleman effect had begun spreading globally, with community governance projects underway in 27 countries across 6 continents. As they greeted the delegation, neither Maria nor Richard fully grasped how completely their partnership had challenged fundamental assumptions about who deserves decision-making power in economic systems. What began with a whispered warning had evolved into a systematic reimagining of the relationship between capital, labor, and community that would continue expanding long after both of them had stepped back from their formal roles. Later that evening, As the international delegation departed, Maria found herself alone in the garden, reflecting on the improbable journey from cleaning woman to institute director to global influence. She thought about her grandfather's bakery, destroyed by a signature on a contract decades earlier, and how that loss had ultimately led to preventing countless similar losses for others. The garden door opened, and a young woman in a maintenance uniform appeared, carrying cleaning supplies. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, startled to find someone in the space. "I was just coming to clean up before tomorrow's event." Maria smiled with recognition and deep understanding. "You're not interrupting. Would you like to join me for a moment? I'd love to hear what you think about this place." The maintenance worker hesitated, then set down her supplies and took the seat Maria offered. As they began talking, the cycle of transformation that had begun 5 years earlier with a whispered warning continued. One conversation, one connection, one recognition of shared humanity at a time. The ripple effect continued outward, changing not just corporate culture but the fundamental understanding of whose voices deserve to be heard when decisions are made about the spaces we all share.